Welcome back, everybody. Hope everyone is doing well. My name is Jason, and in today's video, we're going to be previewing the 2023 Hamilton Tigercats. And starting off with their previous season in 2022, very disappointing season overall for them last year, finishing with an 8-10 record. It was 4-10 until the last month of the season, where they went on a little bit of a run there to get into the playoffs, ultimately losing in the East semifinal to Montreal in a pretty convincing way. So honestly, big changes were needed this offseason in Hamilton, and we certainly got them with their additions and subtractions this offseason. So talking about their biggest addition and biggest loss, their biggest addition, of course, is bringing in quarterback Bo Levi Mitchell, who they traded for from the Calgary Stampeders. Obviously, Bo has an incredible CFL resume, one of the best we've seen from a CFL quarterback in terms of winning percentage, has won 2 Grey Cups, 2 MOPs, but we haven't seen that level of Bo in a few years, so it's by no means a guarantee that he is going to rebound here in Hamilton, but certainly we've seen in the past CFL players go to different locations and suddenly have a career resurgence. Look no further than Zach Collaros, so I'm excited to see what happens with Bo Levi Mitchell this year in Hamilton. They bring in several other players as well. I recommend, if you want my thoughts on those players, go check out my free agency recap video on the Hamilton Tigercats, where I went over all the additions they made. But Bo Levi Mitchell, definitely the biggest and most consequential addition that they made this offseason. Now, in terms of their biggest loss this offseason, there are other players that you could choose, but I'm going with defensive back Cariel Brooks, who they actually released a little bit into free agency this year. Has been a very competent player over the past couple of years, one of the better defensive backs in the Canadian Football League. I have him on my top 50 players list for this season, and I think he's going to be a very big addition for the Ottawa Red Blacks. And, obviously Hamilton's going to be missing him going into this year. They lost a lot of pieces in the defensive back room. We'll talk about more of that in a second, but at the end of the day, I think Brooks in particular is going to be a pretty big loss for Hamilton, and we'll see how they cope without him. Now, moving on to talk about this roster, and I think this roster really rapidly improved via their big additions this offseason. In terms of offense, I have them ranked as the 3rd best offense in the CFL, which was a major improvement over where I had them last year. I think I had them 8th last year, but you see the change in quarterback, the additions along the offensive line, I think it was a big key for this team. The offensive line was very weak going into last year, but they made some really big additions. A lot of them during last year via trade. You bring in David Beard from Edmonton. I think that was huge to stabilize that offensive line. They bring in Joe Figueroa this offseason. I think those are going to be very, very key players for them this season along the offensive line, and gives them their best front since that 2019 season where they went 15-3. And I think that in terms of the running back room, bringing in James Butler is a dramatic upgrade over what they had there last year. And I think in terms of the receiving core, yes, you have some depth questions, but you do have some guys that have been stars at this position in the league before, in Tim White, who obviously had an amazing season last year and the last couple of years, and then Duke Williams, who has been a star in this league before, who was coming off a down year in Saskatchewan. So I think that even though that wide receiver core lacks depth, I think they still have the star power to potentially be one of the best offenses in the league, and that's why I have them ranked as the 3rd best offense in the league going into this year. In terms of their defense, I have them ranked as the 4th best defense in the CFL. I'm pretty high on this unit as well. I think that the defensive line in particular has added a lot of depth throughout this offseason. It really was a weak point of this team last year after they had lost Jared Davis. They bring him back in free agency this year, so hopefully he can make an impact and be his regular 7 to 12 sack guy in this league. And I think that Malik Carney is a budding pass rusher, had a couple of big games last year for the Tigercats. Hopefully he can put it together more consistently. And I think that, they have a couple of really good Canadian players on that defensive line. Obviously, the ageless Ted Laurent is still going to be a part of that rotation, but you have Mason Bennett at defensive end. They bring in Kwaku Boateng, who missed all of last year with Ottawa, but really a dynamic Canadian player and pass rusher when he's healthy. So I think at the end of the day, that defensive line has shown a lot of improvement over this offseason, at least on paper. So I'm excited to see how that unit plays this year. I think the linebacking duo of Simone Lawrence and Jameer Thurman back there is going to be very, very potent for this team. So I'm very confident in the Tigercats front 7, But I think in terms of the secondary is where I have the questions. They lost, like I said, Cariel Brooks, but also Deontay Evans and Jamal Roll. So 3 of their 5 starters from last year in the secondary gone. So that's my only pause for concern for this defense. But you still have a couple of noteworthy veterans back there in Tunde Adeleke, one of the better Canadian players in the league at safety, and then you have Richard Leonard at half. So I think that there's enough there to potentially coach up the young guys, and if you can get a couple of young guys to really step up into those roles, I think that's what they're going to need this year. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I think they're capable of doing that, and that's why I'm confident putting them as the 4th-best defense in the CFL right now. Now, in terms of Canadian talent, it really surprised me when I looked at it because I didn't think I would have Hamilton ranked as high as 3rd, which I have them here. But at the end of the day, I was looking at other teams across the board and looking at the criteria that I used last year to define how I rank Canadian talent in the CFL. And I think that, you look at the Tigercats offensive line, like I said, a lot of these Canadian players that they've brought in over the last couple of years look very sturdy in terms of that offensive line. Obviously, David Beard, Ravenberg's been a star for years for this team. Woodmansey emerging, and then if you get anything out of Chris Van Zel at this point at 40 years old, would be a bonus for the Tigercats. But I think in terms of the offensive line talent, one of the better units in the league in terms of their Canadian players. And then I think that, obviously Adeleke back there at safety. You have Bennett there at defensive end. You have some emerging players pretty much at every position group. I'm interested to see what happens with the Canadian wide receivers, which they may start 2 of them this year. Keandre Smith, I think, is the best of the bunch. In my opinion, I think he has the most potential as kind of a bigger body guy that showed a lot of promise in year 1. But there are other guys there like Tyler Ternowski and others. So we'll see what happens with those Canadian receivers, if that's one concern I would have for that team in terms of their Canadian talent. But at the end of the day, I think it's one of the better units in the league in terms of Canadian talent, and I have them ranked 3rd. Now let's talk about the Hamilton Tigercats' strengths and weaknesses. How is this team going to win games this year, and how do I think they're going to lose games this year? And in terms of strengths, I think that offensive line is very key for this team. This was definitely not a strength going into last year, but I really think because of those additions they've made over the past year and a half, going back to about midway through last year with the Beard trade, the Saxlid trade at the beginning of last year. I think those are really key moves for this team going forward, and that offensive line depth and talent overall for the starters should give them an advantage going forward, and they should be able to move the pile in the run game a little bit more than they have in recent years. So I'm excited to see what happens with that. I think the defensive line depth, like I was mentioning a few minutes ago, could be a big advantage for this team. They're going to have a healthy rotation, especially with the Canadian guys. I think the Boateng addition could really be a big benefit for this team down the stretch this year. He may not be healthy to start the year. He's coming off a pretty serious injury, but I think that by the end of the year, he could be a very serious contributor to this defense. And Ja'Garett Davis, like I was mentioning before, could be a massive addition to bring back here into the fold. And I think having a true number 1 receiver is just super key in the CFL. There's not too many teams that have that true go-to guy, but the Tigercats certainly have that in Tim White, who really proved himself as that player last year. Just go and watch that game that they played at Calgary near the end of last year. He's just clearly a number 1 receiver in this league. So I think that is a huge advantage for the Tigercats going forward. And I think that these are the reasons why the Tigercats should be able to win a lot of games this year. Now, on the other hand, I think that the Tigercats, one thing they lack is proven wide receiver depth. And I'm wearing my Braylon Addison jersey, who they recently released. He was projected to be probably their 3rd target in the offense behind Tim White and Duke Williams. So very interested to see how they navigate that loss and what young players step up. Like I mentioned, the Canadian wide receiver situation, perhaps they start 2 Canadian receivers and go with 3 Americans instead of 4 Americans and 1 Canadian. So we'll see what happens with that for the Tigercats. Big question going into this year. There's going to have to be some guys that step up in this receiving core. We have seen that in the CFL in the past. Receiver be one of the easier positions to transition into the CFL. But at the end of the day, that's something that has to be answered with this Tigercats team this year, that wide receiving depth. And then I think in terms of the defensive back room, as I mentioned before, they lost 3 of their 5 starters from last year. So they're going to have to get some really inexperienced players or players that didn't play a whole lot at other CFL locations to really step up. I'm looking at Javian Elliott, who didn't play a whole ton with the Stampeders, but is penciled into one of those starting roles here in Hamilton. Has a little bit of CFL experience under his belt, so we'll see if players like that start to step up for this team this year. They're going to need it after the departures they had this offseason. Now turning to talk about their 2023 schedule, the opening to it that is. So week 1, they're at Winnipeg. It seems like they've played Winnipeg in the opening game a few times now in the past few years. So should be very interesting, very tough ask for Bo Levi-Mitchell in his first game to go to Winnipeg and win, but hopefully it's a very good game, and Hamilton, for my sake as a Tigercats fan, they come out on top. And then week 2, they're at Toronto. Another difficult game on paper because Toronto has usually played well at home the past couple of years. Of course, you have the wild card of Chad Kelly in his first start as a CFL starter. So I'm very interested to see how they play in that one. I will be attending that game in person. And then week 3, they have their home opener against Montreal. Again, as a Tigercats season ticket holder, I will be at that game. And then week 4, they have the bye week. And then week 5, they're home against Ottawa, a team that they've been pretty comfortable playing the past couple of years. But we have yet to see that Mazzoli versus the Tigercats revenge game. So I'm excited to see if that game happens, if Mazzoli's healthy at that point in the season. And then week 6, they're at Edmonton. Should be very interesting with the new look Elks there. So at the end of the day, I don't think it's the worst schedule in the world to begin the year, but those first 2 games should be a good test for the Tigercats. Now, in terms of my general prediction for this team this year, I have some pause for concern in terms of Bo Levi-Mitchell getting back to that elite level, but I think that he will be re-energized by this. There is a chance that he really does rebound and become one of the best quarterbacks in this league yet again, in a brand new location, playing out in the weaker Eastern Division. So I think there's possibility for a big bounce back, and I think for this team, with the new additions, to really click and be one of the best teams in the CFL this year. But I think at minimum, this team has proven even last year that with that horrible start, they still finished with 8 wins. I think that's kind of the floor for this team this year. So I'm going to say the floor for this team is 8 wins, and the ceiling is 12 wins this year. But I think it's probably going to be around somewhere in the middle, probably around 10 wins, but you'll have to wait to see my full season predictions for that. But with that said, that is going to be the end of today's video, and I want to thank each and every one of you for watching. Be sure to let me know your thoughts on the 2023 Hamilton Tigercats down below. And with that said, hope you guys have a great day, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace.